What if I told you that everything you think you know about the Druids, history, philosophy, religion, is not all true? For centuries, our understanding of these enigmatic ancient Celtic figures has been shaped by fragmented Roman accounts, medieval folklore, and later romanticized interpretations. Often portrayed as mystical priests performing dark rituals in oak groves or as wise, nature-loving philosophers, the popular image of the Druid is a complex tapestry woven from fact, fiction, and assumption. But what if the threads of truth are far more nuanced, and much of what we've been taught obscures a more fascinating and less understood reality? It's time to peel back the layers of myth and re-examine the truth. In the misty forests of ancient Europe, where oak trees stretched their ancient limbs toward the sacred skies, a people existed whose very name conjures images of mystery, wisdom, and power that transcended the physical realm. Tonight we embark on a journey through time itself, peeling back layers of myth and misconception to reveal the true story of the Druids. Not as Hollywood has portrayed them, not as Victorian romantics imagined them, but as they truly were. The intellectual elite of Celtic society, the keepers of law and lore, the bridge between the mortal world and the divine mysteries that lay beyond. For too long, the story of the Druids has been shrouded in deliberate secrecy and accidental confusion. Roman propaganda painted them as savage priests conducting human sacrifice in dark groves. Medieval Christian writers dismissed them as devil-worshipping pagans standing in opposition to the true faith. Modern popular culture has reduced them to fantasy caricatures, white-robed figures wielding magical powers in stone circles that they never actually built. But strip away these layers of distortion, and what emerges is far more fascinating than any fiction. A sophisticated class of scholar priests who served as judges, teachers, healers, astronomers, and political advisors across the Celtic world. The very word druid derives from the ancient Celtic term meaning oak wisdom, or those who know the oak, reflecting their deep connection to the natural world that was both practical and profoundly spiritual. These were not primitive shamans dancing around fires, but learned individuals who underwent decades of training, memorizing vast repositories of oral tradition that encompassed law, history, genealogy, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. In societies that valued memory over written word, the Druids were living libraries, human repositories of accumulated wisdom spanning generations. Caesar himself, despite his obvious bias as a conqueror, couldn't help but acknowledge their intellectual prowess. He wrote that young men flocked to the Druids for instruction, that they memorized enormous quantities of verse, some studying for 20 years or more, and that they served as judges in disputes determining punishments and rewards, excommunicating those who disobeyed their decisions. This was no primitive superstition, but a sophisticated system of education and jurisprudence that maintained order across tribal boundaries. But the Druids were far more than scholars and judges. They were the spiritual architects of Celtic society, weaving together the practical and the mystical in ways that the Roman mind, with its compartmentalized approach to religion and governance, struggled to comprehend. They read omens in the flight of birds and the patterns of wind through leaves. They calculated the movements of celestial bodies with remarkable precision, creating calendars that govern both agricultural cycles and sacred festivals. They understood the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants, serving as both physicians and pharmacists to their communities. Their religious practices centered not on the worship of distant anthropomorphic deities, but on the recognition of divine presence within the natural world itself. Every grove was potentially sacred, every spring might be blessed, every hilltop could serve as a connection point between earth and sky. This was animism elevated to high art, a sophisticated theology that saw the divine not as separate from creation but as intimately woven through every aspect of the natural world. The oak tree held special significance in Druidic practice, not merely as a symbol but as a living embodiment of sacred wisdom. The oak's longevity, some trees living for over 1,000 years, made it a bridge between past and future, a silent witness to the passage of generations. Its deep roots and spreading canopy represented the Druidic ideal of knowledge that was both grounded in practical wisdom and reaching toward transcendent understanding. When Druids gathered in oak groves for their most sacred ceremonies, they were not simply choosing convenient meeting places, but acknowledging their role as intermediaries between the earthly and divine realms. The mistletoe that occasionally grew upon oak trees was particularly sacred, seen as a gift from the sky gods themselves. The famous image of the white-robed druid cutting mistletoe with a golden sickle, recorded by Pliny the Elder, captures something essential about Druidic practice: the careful, ritualized harvesting of natural substances believed to possess healing or magical properties. This wasn't mere superstition, but represented a sophisticated understanding of botanical medicine combined with spiritual practice. Yet for all their reverence for nature, the Druids were not primitive eco-mystics, but active participants in the complex political landscape of Celtic Europe. They served as advisors to kings and chieftains, their decisions carrying weight precisely because they were seen as speaking not merely from personal opinion, but from deep wells of traditional wisdom and divine inspiration. A Druid's pronouncement could start wars or end them, legitimize rulers or destroy their authority, bind communities together or tear them apart. This political influence stemmed from their unique position outside normal tribal loyalties. While warriors owed allegiance to specific chiefs and craftsmen worked within particular communities, Druids moved freely across tribal boundaries, their sacred status protecting them even in times of conflict. This mobility allowed them to serve as diplomats and negotiators, carrying messages between hostile groups and helping to maintain some semblance of unity across the fractured Celtic world. The training required to become a Druid was legendary in its intensity and duration. Young candidates, usually drawn from aristocratic families, would spend years memorizing vast cycles of poetry that contained the accumulated wisdom of their tradition. There were poems detailing genealogies stretching back dozens of generations, legal precedents governing everything from property disputes to criminal punishment, astronomical observations tracking the movements of sun, moon, and stars, and mythological narratives that encoded both historical memories and spiritual teachings. This oral tradition was maintained not from any inability to write. The Celts were perfectly capable of literacy when it suited their purposes, but from a deliberate choice to keep sacred knowledge within controlled channels. Written words could be stolen, copied, or misinterpreted, But oral tradition required living relationships between teachers and students, masters and apprentices. The knowledge literally died with its keepers unless it was properly transmitted, creating powerful incentives for accuracy and respect. The Druidic understanding of time itself differed radically from Roman linear concepts. For the Druids, time was cyclical, with past, present, and future interconnected in complex patterns that could be read and interpreted by those with sufficient wisdom. This wasn't fatalism, but a sophisticated recognition that understanding historical patterns could provide guidance for present decisions and future planning. The Wheel of the Year, with its 8 major festivals marking the progression of seasons, wasn't merely a calendar but a spiritual framework for understanding the eternal dance between light and darkness, growth and decay, life and death. Their festivals revealed this cyclical thinking at its most profound. Samhain, marking the beginning of winter, was understood as a time when the boundaries between worlds grew thin, allowing communication with ancestors and glimpses of futures yet to come. Beltane, celebrating the return of fertility and growth, involved rituals designed to ensure the prosperity of crops and herds, while honoring the creative forces that brought new life into being. These weren't quaint seasonal celebrations, but sophisticated ceremonies acknowledging humanity's dependence on natural cycles while seeking to influence those cycles through proper ritual action. The Druidic approach to justice was equally sophisticated, based not on rigid legal codes but on precedent, circumstance, and the pursuit of balance rather than mere punishment. When disputes arose, Druids would consider not only the immediate facts but the wider implications for community harmony. The historical relationships between the parties involved, and the spiritual consequences of various possible resolutions. Their goal was healing rather than retribution, restoration rather than destruction. This holistic approach extended to their understanding of healing itself. Druidic medicine combined practical knowledge of herbal remedies with spiritual practices designed to address the underlying causes of illness. They understood that physical symptoms often reflected spiritual imbalances, that healing required attention to the whole person rather than merely treating isolated conditions. Their reputation as healers stemmed not from magical thinking but from a sophisticated integration of empirical observation with psychological and spiritual insight. The Roman conquest of Celtic lands marked not just a political transformation but a cultural catastrophe of enormous proportions. The systematic destruction of Druidic institutions represented the deliberate erasure of an entire intellectual tradition, the silencing of voices that had maintained continuity with Europe's pre-Roman past. When Roman legions stormed the sacred island of Anglesey in 60 CE, burning the groves and slaughtering the Druids they found there, they weren't simply eliminating political opposition but committing cultural genocide on a massive scale. Yet the story of the Druids didn't end with Roman conquest or Christian conversion. Elements of their tradition survived in the folklore and customs of Celtic peoples, in the wisdom traditions of Irish Philid and Welsh bards, in the herbal knowledge of village wise women and the astronomical observations of medieval monks. The old knowledge went underground, disguised as entertainment or dismissed as superstition, but it never entirely disappeared. Understanding the true history of the Druids requires us to look beyond romantic fantasies and Victorian inventions to recognize them as what they actually were. The intellectual and spiritual elite of one of Europe's most sophisticated pre-Roman civilizations. They were philosophers and scientists, judges and healers, poets and astronomers, combining roles that later societies would fragment into separate specializations. Their legacy lies not in the stone circles they never built, or the human sacrifices they may or may not have performed, but in their demonstration that wisdom traditions can maintain sophistication and relevance across centuries of oral transmission. Tonight, as we stand at the threshold of exploring their world, we carry with us both the excitement of discovery and the sobering recognition that much has been lost forever. The voices of the Druids fell silent long ago. Their groves burned, their traditions fragmented. But in the whisper of wind through oak leaves and the turn of seasons that still governs our world, something of their wisdom endures, waiting for those patient enough to listen and humble enough to learn. The Druids possessed one of history's most sophisticated spiritual cosmologies, centered on a profound understanding of the natural world that modern minds struggle to fully comprehend. Their beliefs were not primitive superstitions, but rather an intricate philosophical system that viewed the entire universe as interconnected, alive, and sacred. At the heart of Druidic thought lay animism, the belief that all things possessed spiritual essence or soul. Every tree held consciousness, every stone carried memory, every stream flowed with divine purpose. This wasn't mere poetic metaphor, but fundamental theology. The Druids perceived what we might call a living universe where divine energy permeated every grain of earth, every blade of grass, every breath of wind. Central to their practice were the sacred groves, particularly oak forests, which they considered earthly temples. The oak tree held special reverence, representing strength, endurance, and connection between earth and sky. Its deep roots reached into the underworld while its branches touched the heavens, making it a perfect conduit for divine communication. When thunder crashed during storms, the Druids saw Zeus or Tyrannus speaking through the oak, its branches becoming lightning rods for celestial messages. Mistletoe elevated this reverence to ritual precision. Growing parasitically on oak trees, mistletoe appeared to derive life from air itself, never touching earth yet thriving. The Druids viewed this as a manifestation of pure spirit, untainted by earthly concerns. Harvesting mistletoe required elaborate ceremony conducted during specific lunar phases, particularly the 6th day after the new moon. The cutting tool had to be a golden sickle, and the mistletoe could never touch ground, caught instead in white cloth. This ritual reflected their belief that certain natural phenomena bridged the gap between material and spiritual realms. Water held equally sacred significance. Springs, wells, and rivers were considered portals to the other world. The Druids believed these waters carried healing properties and prophetic visions. Sacred pools received offerings of weapons, jewelry, and precious objects, not as sacrifices to appease angry gods, but as communion with the divine consciousness that flowed through all things. Archaeological evidence from sites like Llyn Terrig Bach in Wales reveals thousands of such offerings, demonstrating the centrality of water worship in Druidic practice. The Druidic calendar reflected their cosmic understanding. They calculated time not by solar years alone, but by complex lunar cycles that tracked both celestial movements and earthly seasons. Their year began with Samhain, when the veil between worlds grew thinnest and communication with ancestors became possible. This wasn't Halloween fantasy, but serious theology based on careful observation of natural cycles and their correlation with spiritual phenomena. 4 major festivals marked their ritual year. Samhain celebrated the end of harvest and beginning of winter's death phase. Imbolc honored the first stirrings of spring and the goddess Brigid's creative fire. Beltane welcomed summer's fertility with bonfires and blessing of livestock. Lughnasadh marked the first harvest and honored the god Lug's sacrifice for abundance. Each festival reflected their understanding that divine energy manifested through seasonal cycles, requiring human participation to maintain cosmic balance. Their concept of time itself differed radically from linear Roman thinking. The Druids embraced cyclical time where past, present, and future intertwined. Death was not ending but transformation, part of an eternal cycle of renewal. This belief influenced their approach to everything from agriculture to governance, viewing all activities as part of larger cosmic patterns that repeated across generations. The otherworld featured prominently in Druidic theology. Unlike the Greek underworld or Christian heaven, the Celtic otherworld existed parallel to earthly reality, accessible through specific locations and rituals. Burial mounds, stone circles, and certain groves served as doorways between worlds. The dead didn't depart to distant realms, but remained present, offering guidance and wisdom to the living. This explains why Druids served as intermediaries between communities and their ancestors, facilitating ongoing relationships across the boundary of death. Their understanding of divine multiplicity reflected sophisticated theological thinking. Rather than worshiping a pantheon of separate deities, they recognized different aspects of universal divine energy manifesting through various forms. Lugh represented illumination and skill. Brigid embodied creativity and healing. Cernunnos symbolized wild nature and fertility. These weren't distinct gods competing for worship, but facets of singular divine consciousness expressing itself through diverse natural phenomena. Druidic ethics emerged from this worldview. Since all existence was interconnected and sacred, moral behavior meant maintaining harmony with natural law. Justice wasn't about punishment, but restoration of balance. Their legal systems emphasized compensation rather than retribution, seeking to heal social wounds rather than inflict suffering. Environmental stewardship was spiritual duty, not mere practical necessity. Their approach to knowledge reflected these beliefs. Druids didn't separate scientific observation from spiritual practice. Astronomy, herbalism, and meteorology were simultaneously practical skills in religious activities. Studying star movements revealed divine intentions. Understanding plant properties accessed nature's healing wisdom. Predicting weather patterns meant interpreting celestial communications. This integration of knowledge and spirituality explains why Druidic education took decades. Students weren't just memorizing facts, but developing consciousness capable of perceiving divine patterns in natural phenomena. The 20-year training period reflected the time needed to cultivate such awareness, transforming ordinary perception into spiritual sight. Their resistance to writing wasn't technological limitation, but theological principle. They believed written words trapped living knowledge, reducing dynamic wisdom to static symbols. Oral transmission kept teachings alive, allowing each generation to reinterpret ancient wisdom according to contemporary needs, while maintaining essential truths. The Druidic worldview profoundly influenced Celtic society's relationship with landscape. Hills, forests, rivers, and plains weren't mere geographical features, but sacred entities with their own consciousness and purpose. Tribal territories were defined not just by political boundaries, but by relationships with local spirits and natural features. This created deep connection between people and place that shaped everything from settlement patterns to military strategy. Their healing practices integrated physical and spiritual dimensions. Illness resulted from imbalance between individual and cosmic harmony. Treatment involved not just herbal remedies, but ritual restoration of proper relationship with natural forces. The physician-priest sought to heal the whole person within their environmental and spiritual context, addressing causes rather than merely symptoms. Perhaps most remarkably, Druidic cosmology anticipated what modern science now recognizes about ecological interconnection. Their understanding that all life forms part of a complex, interdependent web mirrors contemporary ecological thinking. Their emphasis on balance and sustainability reflected sophisticated grasp of natural systems that modern environmentalism is still learning to appreciate. The Roman suppression of Druidism represented more than political conquest. It marked the collision between two fundamentally different ways of understanding reality. Roman materialism and linear thinking could not accommodate Druidic holistic spirituality and cyclical cosmology. Yet despite systematic persecution, elements of Druidic wisdom persisted in folk traditions, seasonal celebrations, and landscape lore that continue influencing Celtic culture today. Understanding Druidic religion and philosophy requires abandoning modern assumptions about primitive versus sophisticated thinking. Their worldview represented one of humanity's most elegant attempts to comprehend existence as unified whole, where matter and spirit, human and nature, individual and cosmos formed seamless tapestry of meaning. This vision continues speaking to contemporary seekers, offering alternative to fragmentary thinking that characterizes much modern consciousness. The Druids created not just a religion, but a complete way of being in the world, one that honored both mystery and knowledge, both individual wisdom and collective memory. Their legacy reminds us that true sophistication might lie not in dominating nature, but in learning to participate consciously in the eternal dance of existence itself. As we venture deeper into the heart of Druidic civilization, we must confront one of history's most persistent questions. What happened to this extraordinary culture that seemed to possess such profound wisdom and spiritual insight? The answer lies not in a single catastrophic event, but in a complex tapestry of conquest, transformation, and remarkable persistence that would echo through the centuries long after the last sacred groves fell silent. The Roman conquest of Celtic lands was not merely a military campaign. It was a systematic cultural eradication designed to uproot the very foundations of Druidic society. Beginning with Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul around 58 to 50 BCE, the Romans recognized that Druids represented far more than religious figures. They were the intellectual backbone of Celtic resistance, the keepers of legal traditions that predated Roman law, and the spiritual leaders whose authority transcended tribal boundaries. Caesar himself wrote extensively about the Druids, describing them with a mixture of respect and strategic concern. He understood that their influence extended far beyond religious ceremony into every aspect of Celtic life: education, justice, politics, and cultural identity. When young Celts gathered in sacred groves to memorize vast stores of oral tradition, they weren't simply learning poetry, they were absorbing a complete worldview that challenged Roman concepts of civilization and governance. The Roman strategy was methodical and devastating. First came the military conquest of Druidic strongholds, most famously the assault on Anglesey in 60 CE under the governor Suetonius Paulinus. This sacred island, known to the Welsh as Ynys Môn, served as a primary center of Druidic learning and ritual practice. Roman historians describe the terrifying scene as legions crossed the Menai Strait to face Druids hurling curses while sacred fires burned and warriors fought with desperate fury to protect their holiest site. But military conquest was only the beginning. The Romans understood that to truly eliminate Druidic influence, they needed to dismantle the entire educational and legal system that sustained Celtic culture. They systematically destroyed sacred groves, burned oral libraries of knowledge, and forbade the practice of Druidic rites. The transmission of knowledge that had sustained Celtic civilization for centuries was deliberately severed, creating a cultural rupture that would echo through generations. Yet the Romans faced an unexpected challenge. Druidic wisdom proved remarkably resilient and adaptable. Rather than simply disappearing, Druidic knowledge began to transform, finding new channels and expressions that would allow core elements to survive even under imperial suppression. The oral tradition that had been the Druids' greatest strength now became their salvation, as knowledge flowed underground through networks of practitioners who adapted their teachings to new circumstances. In Ireland, which remained largely beyond direct Roman control, Druidic traditions continued to flourish and evolve. Irish Druids known as Fili maintained their roles as poets, legal experts, and keepers of cultural memory well into the Christian era. They developed sophisticated techniques for preserving oral tradition, creating elaborate mnemonic systems that could transmit complex legal codes, historical narratives, and mythological cycles across generations with remarkable accuracy. The relationship between Druidism and early Christianity reveals one of history's most fascinating cultural negotiations. Rather than simply replacing pagan traditions, early Christian missionaries in Celtic lands often found themselves engaging with a sophisticated philosophical and spiritual system that shared surprising common ground with their own teachings. Both traditions emphasized the sacred nature of creation, the importance of wisdom and learning, and the interconnectedness of spiritual and natural worlds. This cultural dialogue produced unique forms of Celtic Christianity that incorporated distinctly Druidic elements. Sacred sites that had been centers of Druidic worship were often converted to Christian use, but they retained their spiritual significance and many of their traditional practices. The Christian concept of saints frequently merged with older Druidic ideas about divine presence in nature, creating a hybrid spirituality that honored both traditions. The famous Celtic monasteries that became centers of learning throughout medieval Europe carried forward many distinctly Druidic approaches to education and scholarship. The emphasis on memorization, the integration of natural observation with spiritual practice, and the holistic approach to knowledge that characterized Druidic education found new expression in Christian monastic schools. Scholars like Columba, Brendan, and other Celtic saints demonstrated an approach to learning that bore clear traces of Druidic influence. Perhaps most remarkably, Druidic legal traditions survived the Roman conquest and continued to influence Celtic society for centuries. The Bran laws of Ireland, which remained in effect until the 17th century, preserved ancient Druidic principles of justice, environmental stewardship, and social organization. These laws reflected a sophisticated understanding of ecological balance, community responsibility, and restorative rather than punitive justice that traced directly back to pre-Roman Druidic legal traditions. The survival of Druidic influence in folk traditions represents another remarkable aspect of cultural persistence. Throughout Celtic lands, traditional practices related to seasonal festivals, herbal medicine, agricultural rituals, and community ceremonies maintained clear connections to ancient Druidic observances. Samhain evolved into Halloween. Beltane survived in May Day celebrations, and countless local customs preserved ancient ways of honoring the turning of seasons and the sacred rhythms of natural life. Archaeological evidence continues to reveal the extent of Druidic cultural influence and its persistence through changing political circumstances. Excavations at sites like Gournay-sur-Aronde in France have uncovered evidence of ritual practices that continued for centuries after Roman conquest, suggesting that Druidic traditions adapted and survived in modified forms long after their official suppression. Sacred deposits, ritual installations, and ceremonial artifacts tell stories of communities that found ways to maintain their spiritual connections to ancient traditions even under foreign rule. The landscape itself became a repository of Druidic memory. Sacred groves, stone circles, ritual pools, and ceremonial pathways remained embedded in the geography of Celtic lands, preserving spatial relationships and environmental knowledge that had been central to Druidic practice. Even when the specific rituals were forgotten, the places themselves continued to hold significance, passing down through generations an intuitive understanding of sacred geography and ecological wisdom. Modern scholarship has revealed that Druidic influence extended far beyond the Celtic world, contributing to broader European intellectual traditions that would shape Western thought for centuries. The Druidic emphasis on natural philosophy, astronomical observation, and holistic approaches to knowledge influenced later developments in medieval science, Renaissance natural philosophy, and even modern ecological thinking. The Druidic understanding of time as cyclical rather than linear, their recognition of interconnection between all aspects of existence, and their integration of spiritual and practical wisdom created conceptual frameworks that would resurface throughout European intellectual history. From medieval alchemists to Renaissance naturalists to modern environmental philosophers, thinkers have repeatedly rediscovered principles that trace back to ancient Druidic insights. Perhaps most significantly, the Druidic approach to education, emphasizing memory, oral transmission, experiential learning, and the integration of different types of knowledge, influenced pedagogical traditions that survived long after the Druids themselves had vanished. The bardic schools of Ireland and Wales, the medieval universities with their emphasis on disputation and memory, and even modern holistic educational approaches all bear traces of ancient Druidic methods. The story of Druidic survival also reveals the remarkable adaptability of wisdom traditions when faced with cultural disruption. Rather than simply disappearing, Druidic knowledge found new forms of expression, new institutional homes, and new ways of transmitting essential insights across generations. This adaptability speaks to the fundamental strength and relevance of Druidic principles, which proved capable of enriching and transforming even the cultures that sought to suppress them. Today, as we face our own ecological and spiritual crises, the persistence of Druidic wisdom offers both inspiration and practical guidance. The ancient Druidic understanding of humanity's place within rather than above the natural world, their recognition of the sacred in everyday experience, and their holistic approach to knowledge and community provide frameworks for addressing contemporary challenges that purely technological or materialistic approaches cannot resolve. The Druids may have vanished as a distinct class of priests and teachers, but their legacy lives on in countless forms, in the stones they held sacred, in the seasonal celebrations that still mark our calendar, in the folk wisdom that guides rural communities, and in the growing recognition that ancient ways of knowing have essential contributions to make to our modern world. Their story reminds us that true wisdom, once discovered and deeply planted, has a remarkable capacity to survive, adapt, and flourish even in the most challenging circumstances. The persistence of Druidic wisdom didn't simply evaporate with the collapse of their formal structures. Instead, it transformed, adapted, and found new vessels for its transmission across the centuries that followed. What we discover when we examine this period closely is that the profound insights of Druidic thought had already woven themselves so deeply into the fabric of Celtic consciousness that they couldn't be entirely erased, even by the most determined efforts of Roman legions or Christian missionaries. The survival mechanisms of Druidic knowledge were as varied as they were ingenious. Folk traditions became living libraries, preserving ancient wisdom in the form of seasonal celebrations, herbal practices, and oral stories that passed from grandmother to grandchild in the quiet moments around winter fires. These weren't merely quaint customs or superstitions, but sophisticated encoding systems that protected essential knowledge about natural cycles, astronomical observations, and healing practices that had been refined over centuries of careful observation and experimentation. Consider the remarkable persistence of the Celtic calendar system, which continued to influence agricultural and social life long after the formal Druidic schools had been disbanded. The eightfold year, with its careful attention to solstices, equinoxes, and cross-quarter days, remained embedded in the rhythms of rural life throughout Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany. Farmers continued to plant and harvest according to these ancient calculations, not because they consciously followed Druidic teachings, but because the knowledge had proven itself effective across generations of practical application. The Brehon laws of Ireland provide perhaps the most extraordinary example of Druidic legal philosophy surviving in written form. These comprehensive legal codes, which governed Irish society until the 17th century, bear the unmistakable hallmarks of Druidic thought in their emphasis on restorative rather than punitive justice, their recognition of women's rights that were advanced for their time, and their sophisticated understanding of environmental stewardship. The concept of honor price, which valued individuals based on their social contributions rather than their birth status, reflects the Druidic emphasis on merit and wisdom over inherited privilege. In the realm of education, the influence of Druidic pedagogical methods can be traced through the development of Irish monastic schools, which became renowned throughout medieval Europe for their scholarship and learning. The emphasis on memorization, oral tradition, and the integration of practical knowledge with spiritual wisdom that characterize these institutions bears striking similarities to the educational approaches of the ancient Druidic colleges. Scholars from across Europe traveled to Ireland to study in these schools, unknowingly absorbing teaching methods that had their roots in pre-Christian Celtic wisdom traditions. The transformation of Druidic spiritual practices into Christian forms represents one of the most fascinating aspects of this cultural transition. Rather than completely replacing Celtic religious concepts, early Christian missionaries in Celtic lands often incorporated them, creating a unique form of Christianity that retained many distinctly Celtic characteristics. The concept of thin places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was particularly permeable found new expression in the designation of holy wells, sacred groves, and pilgrimage sites that often coincided with ancient Celtic sacred spaces. Celtic Christianity's emphasis on the natural world as a revelation of divine presence, its acceptance of female spiritual authority in certain contexts, and its integration of seasonal celebrations into the Christian calendar, all reflect the influence of earlier Druidic thought. The figure of Bridget, who seamlessly transitioned from Celtic goddess to Christian saint while retaining her associations with poetry, smithcraft, and healing, exemplifies this syncretic process that allowed essential elements of Druidic wisdom to survive within new religious frameworks. The preservation of Celtic languages themselves became crucial vessels for maintaining Druidic concepts and worldviews. Irish, Welsh, Scottish, Gaelic, and Breton retained vocabulary and conceptual frameworks that reflected distinctly Celtic ways of understanding the world. The Irish concept of dúchas, which encompasses ideas of heritage, belonging, and cultural inheritance that are almost impossible to translate into other languages, preserves a worldview that has its roots in Druidic understanding of the relationship between people and place. Medieval Irish literature, particularly the great saga cycles like the Táin Bó Cúailnge and the Fenian cycle, continue to transmit Druidic wisdom through the medium of storytelling. These narratives, while entertaining on their surface, encoded sophisticated teachings about ethics, leadership, the relationship between human society and the natural world, and the proper conduct of life. The figure of the wise counselor in these stories often bears the characteristics of the ancient Druid, serving as the keeper of law, tradition, and sacred knowledge. The persistence of certain magical practices and beliefs throughout Celtic regions also demonstrates the survival of Druidic elements in popular culture. The practice of seeking guidance from trees, the belief in the healing properties of specific plants gathered at particular times, and the continued reverence for sacred wells and springs all reflect the continuation of Druidic natural philosophy at the folk level. These practices adapted to changing religious contexts while maintaining their essential character and effectiveness. The role of bards and storytellers in preserving and transmitting Druidic wisdom cannot be overstated. These cultural figures, who often enjoyed special status and protection even in Christianized societies, maintained the oral traditions that contained encoded Druidic teachings. Their performances weren't merely entertainment, but served as vehicles for cultural education, moral instruction, and the preservation of historical memory. The complex metrical forms of Celtic poetry, with their intricate patterns of alliteration, assonance, and internal rhyme, served as sophisticated mnemonic devices that ensured accurate transmission of important information across generations. Even in the realm of healing and medicine, Druidic knowledge found new forms of expression. The tradition of folk healers, herbalists, and wise women who maintained extensive knowledge of plant medicines and healing practices represents a direct continuation of Druidic medical expertise. These practitioners often worked within Christian frameworks, invoking saints rather than Celtic deities. But their fundamental approach to healing, with its emphasis on treating the whole person and understanding the interconnections between physical, emotional, and spiritual health, remained essentially unchanged from earlier Druidic practices. The influence of Druidic thought on the development of Celtic art and craftsmanship also persisted long after the formal collapse of Druidic institutions. The characteristic interlacing patterns, spiral motifs, and symbolic representations found in Celtic metalwork, stone carving, and manuscript illumination reflect aesthetic principles and symbolic systems that originated in Druidic culture. These artistic traditions continued to evolve and develop, but they maintained their distinctively Celtic character through the preservation of underlying symbolic meanings and aesthetic principles. The survival and transformation of Druidic wisdom also found expression in the continued importance of certain sacred sites throughout Celtic regions. Stone circles, holy wells, and other ancient sacred places remained focal points for community gatherings, seasonal celebrations, and personal pilgrimage long after their original religious contexts had changed. These sites served as anchors for cultural memory, maintaining connections to ancient wisdom traditions even as the specific forms of religious practice evolved. What emerges from this examination of Druidic persistence is a picture of remarkable cultural resilience and adaptability. Rather than disappearing entirely, Druidic wisdom demonstrated its vitality by finding new forms of expression that allowed it to remain relevant and influential across changing historical circumstances. This adaptability itself reflects one of the core principles of Druidic thought: the understanding that wisdom must be living and responsive to changing conditions rather than rigid and unchanging. The legacy of this persistence extends far beyond the Celtic regions where it originated. The influence of Celtic Christianity on the broader development of European Christianity meant that Druidic concepts and approaches spread throughout the continent and beyond. The ecological consciousness, emphasis on local adaptation, and integration of spiritual and practical knowledge that characterized Celtic Christian communities influenced monastic communities, agricultural practices, and educational institutions across medieval Europe. This remarkable story of survival and transformation reminds us that genuine wisdom traditions possess an inherent vitality that allows them to transcend the specific historical circumstances of their origin. the core insights of Druidic thought about the interconnectedness of all life, the importance of living in harmony with natural cycles, and the value of wisdom traditions that integrate practical knowledge with spiritual understanding continue to resonate with contemporary concerns and challenges. The persistence of Druidic influence demonstrates that profound cultural traditions don't simply disappear when their institutional forms are destroyed. Instead, they find new channels for expression, new contexts for relevance, and new ways of contributing to human understanding and flourishing. This process of cultural evolution and adaptation offers valuable insights into how wisdom traditions can remain vital and influential across centuries of historical change. As we navigate the turbulent waters of modern existence, the ancient wisdom of Druidism continues to speak to contemporary seekers, offering profound insights that transcend the boundaries of time and culture. The enduring legacy of these Celtic sages manifests not merely as historical curiosity, but as living wisdom that addresses our deepest contemporary challenges. Consider how Druidic teachings anticipated many principles we now recognize as essential for sustainable living. Their understanding of ecological interconnectedness, seeing the sacred grove as a living system where every element supports the whole, prefigures modern ecological science by millennia. Where contemporary environmentalism speaks of ecosystems and biodiversity, the Druids spoke of the sacred web of life, understanding intuitively what we now prove through scientific method. The Druidic approach to justice offers particularly relevant insights for our time. Their emphasis on restorative rather than punitive justice, seeking to heal communities and restore harmony rather than simply punish wrongdoing, anticipates contemporary movements toward transformative justice. The Brehon laws, with their sophisticated understanding of social relationships and their emphasis on compensation and community healing, provide models that modern legal systems are only beginning to rediscover. Perhaps most significantly, Druidic spirituality offers an alternative to the materialistic worldview that dominates contemporary culture. Their recognition of the sacred in nature, not as resource to be exploited but as living presence to be honored, challenges the fundamental assumptions of industrial civilization. This perspective becomes increasingly vital as humanity grapples with climate change, biodiversity loss, and the spiritual emptiness that often accompanies material prosperity. The Druidic integration of intellectual rigor with spiritual insight provides a model for healing the artificial divide between reason and faith that has plagued Western thought for centuries. Their scholars were simultaneously scientists, philosophers, judges, and spiritual guides, demonstrating that true wisdom emerges from the integration of multiple ways of knowing, rather than from narrow specialization. Their oral tradition, while seeming primitive to modern minds accustomed to written records, actually demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how knowledge is truly transmitted. The living word, passed from teacher to student through direct relationship, carries not just information but wisdom, the understanding of how knowledge applies to life's complexities. This recognition of the importance of mentorship and community in learning challenges our increasingly isolated and digitized approaches to education. The Druidic understanding of time as cyclical rather than linear offers healing for contemporary anxiety about progress and achievement. Their celebration of seasonal cycles and natural rhythms provides antidote to the relentless pace of modern life, reminding us that rest and renewal are not luxuries but necessities for sustainable existence. Their recognition that all things have their season, including decline and death, offers wisdom for accepting life's inevitable changes with grace rather than resistance. Their sophisticated understanding of the relationship between individual and community provides guidance for navigating contemporary tensions between personal freedom and social responsibility. Druidic society recognized individual gifts and callings while maintaining strong community bonds, demonstrating that personal fulfillment and social harmony need not be opposing forces. The Druidic legacy also speaks to contemporary spiritual seekers who find themselves between traditions, those who cannot accept the dogmas of organized religion yet refuse the sterility of pure materialism. Their approach to the sacred, empirical yet mystical, grounded in nature yet reaching toward transcendence, offers a path that honors both scientific understanding and spiritual longing. Their influence on Celtic Christianity demonstrates how authentic wisdom can bridge different religious traditions without losing its essential character. The Celtic Church's emphasis on creation spirituality, its recognition of the sacred feminine, and its integration of pre-Christian wisdom with Christian teaching provide models for interfaith dialogue and spiritual synthesis that remain relevant today as we face the challenges of the 21st century. Environmental crisis, social fragmentation, spiritual emptiness, and technological disruption. The wisdom of the Druids offers not escape into romantic nostalgia, but practical guidance for creating more sustainable and meaningful ways of life. Their legacy reminds us that human beings have successfully created societies that honored both individual development and ecological harmony, both intellectual achievement and spiritual depth. The true revolution of Druidic wisdom lies not in its specific practices, though many of these remain valuable, but in its fundamental orientation toward life as sacred, interconnected, and meaningful. This perspective, when integrated with contemporary knowledge and adapted to modern circumstances, offers hope for creating a civilization that serves both human flourishing and planetary well-being. In rediscovering the Druids, not as primitive ancestors but as sophisticated teachers whose insights transcend their historical context, we find not only a richer understanding of our past, but practical wisdom for creating a more sustainable and spiritually fulfilling future. Their legacy challenges us to move beyond the false choices that limit contemporary discourse between reason and intuition, individual and community, human needs and environmental protection, and to discover the deeper harmonies that make integrated living possible. The Druids understood what we are slowly relearning, that true wisdom emerges not from dominating nature but from participating consciously in the greater web of life of which we are part. In this understanding lies both the ancient path and the future way, a wisdom as relevant today as it was in the sacred groves of Celtic antiquity. As we journey deeper into the heart of Druidic wisdom, we discover that their understanding extended far beyond the earthly realm, into the very fabric of the cosmos itself. The Druids were not merely earthbound mystics. They were cosmic philosophers who saw the universe as an interconnected web of divine intelligence, where every star, Every season, every breath of wind carried sacred meaning. Their astronomical knowledge was breathtaking in its precision. While other cultures looked to the heavens with wonder, the Druids mapped them with mathematical exactitude. They understood that the movements of celestial bodies were not random occurrences, but part of a grand cosmic symphony, each planet and star playing its designated role in the eternal dance of creation. The famous Coligny calendar, discovered in fragments but revealing remarkable sophistication, demonstrates their ability to track lunar and solar cycles with accuracy that rivals modern calculations. The Druids recognized 13 lunar months in their sacred year, acknowledging the feminine principle of the moon as equally important to the masculine solar cycle. This lunar wisdom informed their understanding of natural rhythms, from the optimal times for planting and harvesting to the most propitious moments for ritual and ceremony. They knew that human consciousness itself waxed and waned with these celestial tides, and they structured their entire social and spiritual calendar around these cosmic pulsations. But their cosmic vision went far deeper than mere calendar keeping. The Druids understood what modern quantum physics is only beginning to rediscover: that consciousness and cosmos are intimately connected, that the observer and the observed are part of one unified field of awareness. They spoke of the thin places where the veil between worlds grew gossamer fine, where the cosmic intelligence could more easily communicate with human consciousness. These thin places were not merely geographical locations, though certain groves and stone circles did serve as amplifiers for cosmic energy. More importantly, the Druids recognized that consciousness itself could become a thin place through proper preparation and attunement. Their extensive training in meditation, their deep communion with nature, their mastery of breath and rhythm all served to refine human awareness until it could perceive the subtle currents of cosmic intelligence flowing through all existence. The Druidic understanding of reincarnation was intrinsically linked to this cosmic awareness. They taught that the soul's journey through multiple lifetimes was not a punishment or a burden, but an opportunity for consciousness to experience itself from countless perspectives, gradually awakening to its true cosmic nature. Each incarnation was seen as a classroom, each challenge as a lesson designed to expand the soul's understanding of universal principles. This cosmic perspective gave the Druids an extraordinary sense of time. While other cultures might think in terms of single lifetimes or even generations, the Druids thought in terms of vast cosmic cycles. They understood that civilizations, like individuals, went through cycles of birth, growth, decay, and renewal. They saw themselves as guardians not just of immediate tribal interests, but of cosmic wisdom that needed to be preserved through the inevitable dark ages that periodically swept across the world. Their oral tradition was not simply a method of preserving information. It was a living technology for encoding cosmic wisdom into human consciousness. Each carefully memorized verse, each precisely repeated ritual formula, each traditional story contained multiple layers of meaning. On the surface level, these might appear to be simple tales or practical instructions. But for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, they contained profound teachings about the nature of reality, consciousness, and the cosmic order. The Druids understood that written language, while useful for mundane affairs, was inadequate for transmitting the deepest truths. Written words could be altered, misinterpreted, or divorced from their living context. But wisdom encoded in living memory, passed from teacher to student in an unbroken chain of transmission, remained vibrant and alive. The very act of memorization was itself a spiritual practice, a way of literally incorporating cosmic wisdom into the fabric of human consciousness. This reverence for memory explains why Druidic training took 20 years or more. Students were not merely learning facts. They were being transformed at the deepest level, their consciousness gradually attuned to cosmic frequencies that most humans never perceive. By the time a student became a full druid, they had become a living repository of cosmic wisdom capable of accessing vast stores of knowledge through intuitive means. The druid's understanding of death reflects this cosmic perspective beautifully. They taught that death was merely a transition, like a soul changing clothes or moving from one room to another. This was not mere consolation for the grieving. It was based on direct perception of consciousness as something far more fundamental than the physical body. Advanced druids were said to remember their previous incarnations and to be able to communicate with those who had passed beyond the veil. This cosmic awareness also informed their approach to healing. While they were certainly skilled herbalists and physicians in the conventional sense, the druids understood that true healing required addressing imbalances at the cosmic level. They recognized that illness often stemmed from disconnection from natural rhythms, from living out of harmony with cosmic principles. Their healing ceremonies were designed not just to treat symptoms, but to restore the patient's alignment with the universal order. The sacred groves where druids gathered were carefully chosen to serve as cosmic amplifiers. These locations were selected not just for their natural beauty, but for their energetic properties. Their ability to focus and concentrate subtle cosmic forces. The druids understood principles of sacred geometry, knowing how to arrange stone circles and other structures to create resonance with celestial movements. These sites became classrooms where students could more easily attune themselves to cosmic frequencies. Within these sacred spaces, the druids practiced forms of meditation and consciousness expansion that allowed them to directly perceive the cosmic order. They spoke of journeying to the other world, of communing with divine beings, of receiving visions that revealed the hidden workings of the universe. These were not mere fantasies or wishful thinking, but systematic explorations of consciousness that yielded practical wisdom for living in harmony with cosmic principles. The Druidic understanding of prophecy emerges naturally from this cosmic awareness. When consciousness is properly attuned to universal rhythms, the future becomes as visible as the past. The Druids could perceive the patterns underlying apparently random events, could see how current actions would inevitably unfold into future consequences. Their prophecies were not supernatural interventions, but natural expressions of cosmic awareness. This cosmic perspective enabled the Druids to maintain hope and purpose even during the darkest periods of their history. When the Romans destroyed their groves and slaughtered their practitioners, when Christianity branded them as demons and drove their wisdom underground, the Druids understood that these were temporary fluctuations in much larger cosmic cycles. They knew that truth has its own momentum, that wisdom properly planted will eventually sprout, no matter how long the winter. The legacy of Druidic cosmic awareness continues to influence human consciousness today. In our modern rediscovery of ecological interconnection, in our growing understanding of consciousness as fundamental to reality, in our recognition that ancient wisdom traditions contain profound truths about the nature of existence, we see the seeds planted by those ancient cosmic philosophers beginning to flower once again. The Druids remind us that we are not isolated beings struggling alone in an indifferent universe, but cosmic citizens participating in a vast, intelligent, purposeful unfolding of consciousness itself. Their wisdom calls us to remember our true nature, to align ourselves with cosmic principles, and to take our rightful place as conscious participants in the eternal dance of creation. In our time of global crisis and transformation, when humanity stands at a crossroads between destruction and transcendence, the cosmic wisdom of the Druids offers both guidance and hope. They understood that consciousness is the ultimate creative force in the universe, that properly aligned human awareness can literally reshape reality in accordance with divine will. Their legacy reminds us that we have the power not just to survive the challenges of our time, but to participate consciously in birthing a new phase of human evolution, one aligned with cosmic wisdom and natural law. As we prepare to explore the culminating insights of Druidic wisdom in our final chapter, we carry with us this profound recognition that we are not merely students of an ancient tradition, but cosmic beings awakening to our true nature and purpose in the grand symphony of existence. In the dim light of ancient halls where mysteries whisper through weathered stone and forgotten texts, we find ourselves at the threshold of wisdom. Tonight we explore the Druids not as popular culture portrays them, but as they truly were. Scholars, judges, astronomers, and guardians of sacred knowledge whose influence shaped civilizations far beyond their Celtic origins. For too long, the story of the Druids has been obscured by Roman propaganda and medieval romanticism. Tonight, we pierce through these veils to discover a sophisticated tradition that understood the cosmos, preserved justice, and maintained harmony between human communities and the natural world. The Druids emerged from the mists of Celtic antiquity as an intellectual elite whose knowledge encompassed law, astronomy, medicine, poetry, and philosophy. Unlike many ancient traditions that relied on written texts, Druidic wisdom was transmitted orally through decades of intensive training. Students would spend 20 years memorizing vast stores of knowledge. Laws, genealogies, astronomical calculations, healing practices, and sacred stories that bound communities together across generations. This oral tradition was not mere conservatism, but sophisticated pedagogy. The human mind, when properly trained, becomes a living library. Druids understood that knowledge transmitted through personal relationship and embodied practice creates deeper understanding than words on parchment. Their students didn't simply learn facts, they internalized wisdom that could adapt to new circumstances while preserving essential truths. The Druidic worldview recognized the universe as an interconnected whole, where all existence participated in sacred patterns. They observed that the movements of celestial bodies corresponded to natural cycles on Earth. The phases of the moon governing tides and plant growth, the sun's journey marking seasons and agricultural rhythms. This wasn't primitive superstition, but sophisticated understanding of cosmic interconnection. Their knowledge of astronomy was remarkably precise. Archaeological evidence reveals that Celtic sacred sites were carefully aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and complex lunar cycles. The Coligny calendar, a bronze tablet discovered in France, demonstrates their ability to reconcile solar and lunar years with mathematical sophistication that rivals later astronomical achievements. But Druidic wisdom extended far beyond star charts and seasonal celebrations. They served as judges, their legal decisions based on principles of restorative justice that sought to heal communities rather than simply punish wrongdoing. Their medical knowledge combined careful observation of plant properties with understanding of psychological and spiritual dimensions of healing. They were poets whose words could inspire courage in battle or seal diplomatic agreements between rival tribes. Perhaps most importantly, the Druids understood themselves as guardians of sacred relationship between human communities and the living world. They recognized that human flourishing depended on maintaining harmony with natural systems. Their teachings emphasized responsibility rather than dominance, reciprocity rather than exploitation. This perspective challenges modern assumptions about ancient peoples. We often imagine early civilizations as primitive, struggling against hostile nature through crude technology and superstitious thinking. The Druids reveal a different possibility: sophisticated cultures that achieved prosperity through understanding and cooperation with natural patterns rather than attempting to control them. Roman conquest brought systematic attempts to destroy Druidic influence. Julius Caesar's accounts, while valuable historical sources, were also propaganda designed to justify imperial expansion. He portrayed Druids as barbaric practitioners of human sacrifice, emphasizing the most sensational aspects while ignoring their roles as scholars, healers, and peacekeepers. The Roman campaign succeeded in eliminating the Druids as a visible institution, but their wisdom proved more resilient than their political power. Celtic legal traditions preserved in texts like the Irish Brehon Laws maintained Druidic principles of restorative justice for centuries after the conquest. Monastic schools in Ireland and Wales continued educational methods that echoed Druidic training, emphasizing memorization, oral transmission, and holistic understanding. Even more importantly, Druidic perspectives on cosmic interconnection and sacred landscape persisted in folk traditions across Celtic regions. Beliefs about sacred wells, healing stones, and seasonal festivals maintained ancient understanding that the earth itself is alive and deserving of reverence. The revival of interest in Druidic wisdom during the Enlightenment and Romantic periods, while often romanticized, reflected genuine recognition that these ancient teachings offered alternatives to mechanistic worldviews that were beginning to show their limitations. Modern environmental movements, holistic healing practices, and indigenous rights advocacy all echo Druidic insights about the necessity of maintaining harmonious relationships with natural systems. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the sophistication of Celtic civilization. Sites like Newgrange in Ireland, older than Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids, demonstrate advanced astronomical knowledge and architectural skill. The Antikythera mechanism, while Greek in origin, reflects the same integration of precise observation and cosmic understanding that characterized Druidic learning. Contemporary scholars increasingly recognize that the Druids represented one of humanity's great intellectual traditions. Their synthesis of scientific observation, philosophical reflection, legal wisdom, and spiritual insight offers profound guidance for addressing current global challenges. Climate change, social inequality, and spiritual disconnection, the crises facing our modern world, might be addressed more effectively through perspectives that recognize the fundamental interconnection of all existence. Druidic wisdom suggests that human communities can thrive not by conquering nature, but by understanding our place within larger cosmic patterns. The Druidic tradition teaches us that consciousness itself is a fundamental force in the universe, not merely an emergent property of complex brains. This perspective opens possibilities for understanding mind, meaning, and purpose that purely materialistic approaches cannot address. Their practices of meditation, contemplation, and communion with natural forces developed human capacities that our technology-focused culture often neglects. Their understanding of time as cyclical rather than linear offers alternative frameworks for thinking about progress, history, and human destiny. Rather than viewing the past as primitive and the future as necessarily better, Druidic wisdom suggests that truth and wisdom are eternal principles that each generation must rediscover and apply to contemporary circumstances. The Druidic emphasis on oral tradition reminds us that the most important knowledge cannot be digitized or stored in databases. Wisdom requires personal relationship, embodied practice, and living transmission from teacher to student. No algorithm can replace the human capacity for insight, compassion, and creative response to unique situations. Their role as mediators between human communities and natural forces suggests models for leadership based on service rather than domination. Druidic judges sought solutions that restored harmony rather than simply imposing punishment. Their healers addressed underlying causes rather than merely treating symptoms. Their teachers cultivated wisdom rather than simply transferring information. The persistence of Druidic influence through centuries of suppression demonstrates the resilience of authentic wisdom traditions. Truth has its own power, independent of political support or institutional protection. Ideas that genuinely serve human flourishing will find ways to survive and emerge in new forms when conditions become favorable. As we face unprecedented global challenges, the Druidic synthesis of scientific observation, ethical reflection, and spiritual insight offers invaluable guidance. Their understanding that human communities must maintain harmonious relationships with natural systems is no longer optional wisdom but urgent necessity. The Druids remind us that we are not separate from nature but participants in cosmic patterns that extend far beyond our immediate perception. Our individual choices affect the whole, just as cosmic rhythms influence our daily lives. This recognition brings both tremendous responsibility and profound comfort. We cannot return to the past, nor should we attempt to recreate ancient institutions in modern contexts. But we can learn from the Druids' integration of knowledge and wisdom, their commitment to justice and healing, their reverence for the sacred dimensions of existence. The Druidic tradition ultimately teaches that wisdom is not a possession to be accumulated, but a way of being to be cultivated. It requires patience, humility, and willingness to see ourselves as students of forces far greater than our individual understanding. In the end, the Druids offer not escape from modernity but transformation of it. Their vision of human communities living in conscious harmony with cosmic patterns provides a framework for creating sustainable, just, and meaningful civilization. Tonight, as we conclude this exploration, we carry forward their understanding that every moment offers opportunities for deeper connection, greater wisdom, and more authentic service to the sacred whole of which we are all part. The Druids may be gone, but their wisdom remains, waiting for those ready to listen with ancient ears and see with eternal eyes. The path they walked continues beneath our feet. The stars they studied still shine overhead. The sacred springs they honored still flow. Their invitation echoes across the centuries. Awaken to the wonder that surrounds us. Remember our place in the cosmic dance, and live with reverence for the mystery that holds us all.